This is a reading from the Gospel of Matthew. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Then children were being brought to him in order that he might lay his hands on them and pray. The disciples spoke sternly to those who brought them, but Jesus said, "Let the children come to me, and do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs." And he laid his hands on them and went on his way. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Last week, I had the honor of leading a group of youth and young adults from this church to the U.S.-Mexico border to work with migrant kids and families. Thanks to your generous donations, we took thousands of pounds of medical supplies, food, clothing, and toys to those living in shelters on the border. With millions of migrants from Venezuela, Guatemala, and El Salvador fleeing the instability and violence of their countries, we quickly found ourselves in the midst and on the front lines of one of the world's biggest human rights crises. Over the past year, Border Patrol's migrant encounters have eclipsed over 2 million people. El Paso's migration is up 51% since last year. Millions of migrants seeking asylum remain camped along the Mexican border. And hundreds of thousands of people find themselves on the U.S. side with no food, shelter, clothing, health care, or safety. Thousands of kids and adults are being bused daily from El Paso to cities across the country where they're literally dropped off with nothing but the clothes on their backs. While our group expected a difficult reality at the border, none of us were prepared for the sheer volume of need that we encountered. Each day we'd get up to work in churches that have become shelters as well as churches, some serving up to 1,700 people each day. We worked in closed closets, served food, and played games with kids whose parents were traumatized from their journey and overwhelmed by their new reality. While the need was overwhelming, we also took solace knowing that these churches were literally saving the lives by providing shelter, food, clothes, and care to thousands of people each day. We knew that the food and the medicine that we had brought was making countless lives better, since literally it would be used the very day to feed and heal people that we had brought it to them. As we finished volunteering on our last day, we made one final supply drop at Dr. Ava Moya's house, a UTEP professor who's helping to distribute over 700 blankets this week to kids along the border. I asked Ava if there's anything else that we should see before we left El Paso. Ava recommended visiting the gallery of Hal Marcus, a local artist famous for depicting the vibrant beauty, spirituality, and culture of the border. He also donates many of his artworks to those different migrant aid organizations to help benefit them, and is considered a border hero. As Hal gave me a tour of his gallery, a painting with Hebrew letters portraying various biblical scenes caught my eye. This painting is at the very front of the church. I invite you all after the service to take a chance and look at it. Depicting stories from the first 5 books of the Bible, Hal gifted this painting to his El Paso synagogue, which turned it into a massive stained glass mural. The first panel of the painting depicts the story of creation. The next shows the Tower of Babel and Abraham. The third portrays Moses and the Exodus story. And the fourth shows the 10 Commandments and a young boy having his bat mitzvah. Scrolled across the painting are Hebrew words from Deuteronomy 31:19. These words say this: "Now write this song and teach it to the children of Israel. The painting covers this song of Deuteronomy as it retells the ancient stories of the Torah and the people's journey with God in relationship. As Hal described this ancient journey to me, I couldn't help but recall the hundreds of migrant families that we had encountered in the shelters who also journeyed thousands and thousands of miles in search only of a better life. As I reflected more on this painting, I was struck by a baby in a basket that's floating along a river. The baby was clearly Moses, whose mother floated him down the Nile River, desperately trying to save her son from an Egyptian genocide. With pity, Pharaoh's daughter finds the 3-month-old baby Moses crying in a basket and asks her maid to find a Hebrew woman to act as a wet nurse to help breastfeed the hungry baby. Staring at the baby Moses, I recalled the story of a father at Sagrado Corazon Shelter, Sacred Heart Church, who was with his 3 daughters that day, a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-month-old baby. While he and his daughters had crossed the border safely, the mother had been detained indefinitely. Like a scene out of ancient Egypt, and unable to feed his crying baby, the mothers in the shelter took pity on this desperate father, as each one of the women took turns to help breastfeed his baby. The image of these women caring for their babies and his is one that I will never forget. While many along the border face serious challenges, injustices, and trauma, our trip made clear that above all, children are the most vulnerable to these hardships. The same was also true in Jesus' day. In today's text from Matthew, we encounter Jesus and the disciples journeying alongside hundreds of desperate families. As the disciples debate who among them is the greatest, Jesus calls over a child out of the crowd. Jesus tells the disciples that to be the greatest, they must become like this little child. Over the centuries, many have debated what Jesus meant by this line. Some say that Jesus was calling us to be innocent like children, to deal and show openness and trust and vulnerability as they encounter the world. Others say that Jesus recognizes that the children exist in a state of constant learning and humility, where they must grow, deal with uncertainty, and have their boundaries constantly tested. Think about it. From the minute a baby is born, they must learn to eat, communicate, and even learn new sleep patterns. It's not long until that baby learns to crawl, to walk, to talk, to read, to understand social cues, and ultimately heads off to school for lots more learning over the next years. Child psychologists acknowledge that children exist in a constant state where they must learn and adapt, which requires great humility, vulnerability, strength, and resilience. While Jesus undoubtedly lifts up all of these qualities in calling us to be like little children, we must not make this passage out to be some kind of quaint tale where Jesus calls over a cute little kid to sit on his lap. Make no mistake, what Jesus is teaching here is fiercely subversive and radically countercultural. To be a child in Jesus' time was incredibly difficult. Over 50% of children died before they reached the age of 5. 70% of children lost one or both of their parents before puberty. Children weren't even considered people. They were considered property, the last to be fed, subject to exploitation, and working in difficult and deplorable conditions. Children suffered the most in times of war, famine, and disease. While women and men often worshiped separately in Jesus' day, children had no way to participate in the religious life of ancient Rome or Judaism. Indeed, children were invisible to the religious community and not considered relevant until they reached the age of maturity and adulthood. Along these lines, have you ever wondered why we have all of these stories about Jesus' birth, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection, but nearly nothing about his childhood? Or perhaps, where did his father Joseph go during these formative years? The Bible is silent on all of that. Indeed, Jesus knows the very heart and soul of the world's children. For as a child, Jesus too was a migrant, forced to flee to safety of another country, and also had lost one of his parents at a young age. Thus, when Jesus tells the disciples to be like children, it's not simply about being teachable, but about being willing to renounce the privileges of adulthood so as to see the world from society's underbelly and the last and the least. So then, what are we to learn from this vantage point? Thinking about this very question while we were on the border, I asked Dr. Ava Moya what she and her students had learned from migrant children that they had encountered. After interviewing dozens of children who were still journeying to the United States, they discovered 3 things that held these kids in common. First was the importance of parents, especially mothers, in offering nurturing, care, and comfort along the journey. The second was the role that faith played in the lives of these kids. The children held a deep belief in a God who cares for them, who loves them, who watches over them, and who journeyed with them. Third, all of the kids held on to hope for a better life. Sitting with this, I was struck at how different this is from perspectives that I regularly encounter in the United States, especially among young people, where there's a continuous debate about the relevancy of God, the church, and faith in our society. Witnessing thousands of migrant kids with great faith and watching churches literally provide the basics for survival, I was struck by how privileged a position it is for us to debate the relevancy of God, faith, and the church. The children and families that we encountered did not have the liberty to debate whether God was relevant in their lives, for God had to be relevant. These children deeply depended on God to provide the strength, the care, the hope, the nurturing needed just to survive that day. Often the very first place that kids and families after crossing the border went to was to churches, trusting that God's family would care and nurture them. So in calling us to be like the little children and to see the world from their perspective, Jesus also is critiquing the religions of his day that excluded children. And he demanded that his followers give children not only a seat at the table, but place them at the head of the table. By lifting up the value of children in front of the disciples, who considered kids beneath them and even an annoying burden, Jesus lays out a radical vision for inclusive community where there's no hierarchy, but all are one in God's family. As Jesus challenges the religious status quo of his day, he opens the door for children and whole families to participate in religious life together. In fact, involving the whole family in faith and worship from the very onset was a major reason why Christianity spread and grew so rapidly in the ancient world. Yet Jesus is clear. The true value of kids and children does not lie solely in what they have to teach us, but in simply who they are. As Jesus says in Matthew 18:5, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. The implications of this line for our world and for our church are massive. Jesus does not just call us to value children, but to see the very face of God in each child. Indeed, when we expend love, hospitality, and care to kids and their families, Jesus says that we directly love, care, and welcome him. So then, what are the practical implications of Jesus' teaching for us and for our church today? Friends, there is a huge number of children and families in desperate need along the U.S.-Mexico border. With our congregation's resources and compassion, there's an even bigger opportunity to make a huge difference. The faith leaders on the border have asked us to consider sponsoring a family, as well as to send more volunteers and donations that are badly needed. Perhaps through this ongoing ministry, we too can learn from the kids on the border to have even greater faith in God who cares for us. We too can learn where our privilege blinds us to the needs of others and where we must depend more deeply on God to meet our everyday needs. Bringing this even closer to home, with New Mexico ranked last in childhood well-being and over 4,000 kids on the Santa Fe South Side, there are a huge opportunity to follow folks like Bill Humphreys and Sharon Eklund by mentoring and tutoring our city's youth. Or take my dad, who recently got recertified as a lifeguard at 74 years young, so he could help keep the city pools open to families and help kids learn how to be able to swim. Or Ed Williams, San's son, who's a Searchlight investigative journalist, whose writings expose the injustices of New Mexico's foster care system and CYFD. My point is that you are never too old, too busy, or too tired to use your gifts to serve, to give back, and to fight for justice for the kids in our state and in our community. Finally, and most closest to home, at Ghost Ranch last year, our church leaders had a retreat, and they identified the need for more youth and families in our congregation. Much of this concern, of course, stemmed from a belief and fear that our church and denomination are getting older. Yet today's gospel passage challenges us to see that having more youth and families in our congregation is not about institutional self-preservation, but it's actually through kids that we encounter the very face of God. It is by providing hospitality to families and supporting a robust youth program that we welcome Christ into our congregation. What the disciples in today's gospel have failed to see, and what we must never forget, is that when we don't actively include children at the heart of our worship and at the very center of our Christian life, we also will fail to see the face of God and welcome Christ into our congregation. Like the disciples, we too will be living an incomplete faith. As today's gospel reminds us, we must never see children as a burden or disruption to our Christian life, for the greatest among us is a little child. By reminding us to be like children, Jesus calls us to greet the world with childlike energy, enthusiasm, and wonder, to never be afraid to learn, to overcome our fears, to be vulnerable, and ultimately to trust that our lives depend on the care of God and others. Today, I want to close my sermon with the words of a man who also knew the heart and soul of our children and who deeply believed that the world and all of the people in it are our neighbors. Presbyterian minister Fred Rogers reminds us, and I quote, "We live in a world in which we need to share responsibility. It's easy to say it's not my child, not my community, not my world, not my problem. Then there are those of us who see the need and respond. I consider those people my heroes." Amen.